Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to the mufcMPB YouTube channel. It's been a while, and from the optimism, of course, of a busy transfer window for Manchester United, we have now seen that very quickly unravel. We've already seen Manchester United lose more games than the top four combined in the Premier League, which, of course, has led to a lot of pressure on Erik Ten Hag. Joining me is the brilliant Ben Jacobs. Ben, thank you so much for joining me. Two questions here, really, in one, if you like. Firstly, what have you made of Manchester United's shocking start to the season, if we're being honest? And how bad is it for Erik Ten Hag at the moment? Are we in a situation already where he could even be sacked after another bad week?
Yeah, if we start with the second part first, Manchester United are calm about the situation, but it's obvious that the next two games are pivotal. So sources make it clear that there won't be a sacking before the international break. And I think it's also apparent that nobody has directly told Ten Hag it's two games or bust. But it's clear that these next two games are very important, especially because you're heading into an international break where there is a natural pause for reflection. And what's going on at the football club at the moment, with Ten Hag being a key part, but also other members of his football department and senior players, is a kind of alignment review or informal review, looking at why the start to the season hasn't been as expected and making sure that everything is on track. And what works perhaps in Ten Hag's favour is the fact that they did a long, meticulous review, went to Ibiza, worked with Ten Hag, set their kind of KPIs, and some of them were about it may take some time. They're going to need integration for some of these players that have joined the club. But it's also Manchester United. And having those two trophies in the Ten Hag era in the bag don't in any way trump the fact that it was the lowest Premier League finish last season ever in the history of the Premier League era. And now they're entering into a season where not much has changed as far as the team's consistency, identity, ability to be clinical, or ultimately get enough points to be starting the season challenging for Champions League football. And I think it was made clear to Ten Hag that there would have to be that improvement in league form. And this was also, to some extent, why instead of getting a new deal, it was felt better just to trigger the additional 1 year in his contract. So that gave Ten Hag still his veto on transfers, but it also means that it would be cheaper comparative to a new deal to get rid of Ten Hag. Still would cost money, but less money, if you see what I mean, than if you handed him, for example, a new 3 to 5 year deal. So the mid point, usually after you've done a review in a summer, is at that festive period where you want to make sure everything's on track. And it feels to me now like they're going to move that forwards and have new input from someone, for example, like Omar Barada, who hadn't started when they were doing this review into Erik Ten Hag. And therefore, there'll be more voices and they'll come in earlier to make sure everybody is aligned. And that's why when they hit that international break, it is going to be important that from Erik Ten Hag's point of view, he shows that he can turn things around. But whether or not it is going to be two games, and if he loses both those two games, he's definitely gone, I think it's too premature to say. And although the start to the season has been bad, there have been these sort of mini moments again that show the potential is there. And that may frustrate Manchester United fans to keep hearing that. But I suppose Chelsea have had that over the last 2 years as well. And it's only really the start to this season under a new ownership where people start to think things are clicking and it's not always one step forwards and two steps back. So Manchester United have only had one summer under this new sporting regime. They've made a fair few signings. Maybe it is going to take a little bit of time, and that could play into Ten Hag's favour because it might buy him a few more games to at least, for example, get to the festive period before this new Ratcliffe-led sporting department start to think about being a little bit more cutthroat. So we have to wait and see. Obviously, when it was Liverpool and 3-0, there was a response. There were two strong games, two clean sheets, 3-0 away at Southampton, 7-0 at Barnsley. and a clean sheet at Palace in a game that really sort of sums up Manchester United's season, because they should have won that. They missed a load of big chances. And in the end, that 0-0 was actually quite a frustrating result. But that's what I mean, that it's kind of a demoralising home loss to Liverpool, a little bit of an upturn, a demoralising home loss to Spurs. And now again, they'll want that little bit of upturn. And if they don't get it, then you would think that during the international break, at least internally, they'll have to have some very serious conversations with Ten Hag, because these consistent Manchester United periods of mediocrity can't continue at a club like this. Otherwise, eventually, we don't know exactly when, but eventually the manager will be the one held accountable and pay the price.
For sure, it's again a situation where Manchester United fans find themselves in a one game away from an absolute crisis, and it almost feels like that, doesn't it? It's almost like the same old story with United. I just want to take your attention now to inside the dressing room. I really want to try and gauge where the players are at in terms of if you've heard anything. What is the feeling within that dressing room? Of course, Manchester United have always been associated with having one or two players who are quite fond of the media, shall we say, without going too much into that. But what can you tell us about the feeling within that dressing room? Are the players almost expecting Erik Ten Hag to be sacked? Has he lost the dressing room? Where are the players' heads right now with Erik Ten Hag?
No, I don't think he's lost the dressing room. There's obviously a difference between players sensing change and wanting change. And I think that was the same with Pochettino at Chelsea. But my understanding is he's not lost the dressing room at all. And if anything, he became closer with the dressing room because many players sympathized with him over the summer due to how long the end of season review was taking and how apparent it was in public, effectively, that Manchester United were also speaking to other candidates. So there were players in the summer that thought the writing was on the wall and expected a new manager. But now, starting the season, were actually quite relieved to have that kind of continuity. But the challenge is that at a big club like Manchester United, and we've seen this with pretty much every single manager since Alex Ferguson left, when things are not going right, you will always have players that feel they can outlast the mediocrity, especially those that maybe are not getting opportunities. And therefore, it is difficult to keep a unified dressing room for any manager at any big club in these kind of circumstances, because you can't do everything right to keep a squad of supposedly elite Premier League players happy. And by supposedly, I don't mean anything disrespectful to anybody. I'm just saying that their talent on paper suggests they should be higher in the league, but at the moment, they're not playing at that elite level. In training, it's business as usual. I think there's one or two actually that are really energized and intent on breaking into the side. You got Mason Mount, for example, who's desperate to get fit and be the kind of player that can create that spark to turn things around. You've got Christian Eriksen, who's had a bit more game time than I think he would have expected at the beginning of the season. You've got Casemiro, who came under a lot of fan criticism and again is keen to respond and not somebody that just wants to jump ship. You've got Bruno Fernandes, who relishes the ability to lead by example, and we now know was unfortunate to get sent off at Spurs because Manchester United won that appeal. And we're having this conversation about Ten Hag, and rightly so, and Manchester United's form, because it isn't only one game. But we wouldn't be having this conversation, at least now, if they'd have beaten Spurs comprehensively. And who knows what would have happened if Bruno Fernandes hadn't have been sent off. They were poor, in fairness, and already trailing when it happened. But nonetheless, it's very difficult to only take that game in isolation when you now know in hindsight that the red card shouldn't have been a red card, because then you're looking at a game where that does influence it ultimately. They might have lost the game 11 versus 11. They had an expected goals, I think, that they gave up of over 4, which they've never had a total that high in the Premier League. So I'm a bit reticent to say that we shouldn't be delving into Spurs because of the Bruno Fernandes sending off and then being overturned, but it is still a factor. and one in many ways that Ten Hag will be able to use internally and say, well, let's take 11 versus 11 and not have referees influence the next two games and then see what happens. So there are players there that are pulling for Ten Hag. There is Bruno Fernandes leading by example. Sources also say that Harry Maguire, ever since he lost the captaincy, has still been acting like a captain and trying to keep everybody unified. And then you've got Kobbie Mainoo and Amad Diallo as well that are hungry and keen to be the kind of ones that excite. So everyone's talking about the new signings, but there's two players there that feel that they can be the ones that get the limelight and make the headlines as well. And then as far as the new signings are concerned, you got Matthias de Ligt and Mazraoui, who Ten Hag knows very well, and Xerxes, who's made a massive impression so far and has been a model professional. So actually 3 of the signings that have come in have had an impact, have made a difference as far as training at Carrington is concerned. And, you know, if Man U are not scoring or winning, people may say, well, should there be a question mark over Xerxes? But I think that he does so much in terms of linking up the play, can move across the whole front line, look at the defensive work and what he does off the ball too. And there has been a team impact made as well. So there's not really a worry about him. And the other 2 so far, I actually think have done well. I know Agate got a bit hammered in the last game, but still not match fit, I'm told. So possibly we should reserve some judgment there. And then Lenny Yoro hasn't played a game due to an unfortunate injury before the season started. So when you kind of started the show and said there was all this excitement about the new signings, they haven't actually had that much of an opportunity to bed in yet, in my opinion. And when you buy with this strategy that Manchester United are trying for, it's a bit different to maybe deciding to spend 300 million on a bunch of mid-20 to 30-year-olds. It might take 5, 10, 15, 20 games. I think back to last season and Rasmus Højlund, who mid-season had a bit of a scoring streak. But again, in that first sort of 10, 15 games of the season, there was a lot of scrutiny on him as well. So herein lies the paradox, because Manchester United can't afford 15 games where they let everyone bed in because they're Manchester United and they need Champions League football. But the way that the strategy works, they kind of need that as well. So there's a balance of patience and appreciation versus, from the fans' perspective, they're impatient. Ten Hag's been there long enough and Manchester United should not be 12th in the table. And I think Ratcliffe is learning the hard way now that he's going to have to balance that. And he is going to be the person in the limelight for both positive and, when applicable, negative reasons. And the Glazers have sort of played a bit of a blinder here in many ways because they're the majority owner. Nobody's mentioning the G word that often anymore. They're there to stand a profit and get all the glory if things go right. But if things go wrong, then it's all Ratcliffe. It's his strategy. It's his people. And they're kind of there silently waiting for the success without maybe as much scrutiny on the failures. And I'm sure they're relatively content at the moment about being in that position. So it is a very interesting dynamic, and it's the first test of this new Ratcliffe-led sporting department. But I'm not hearing that much in terms of players falling out, players being irritated, players being annoyed with Ten Hag specifically. It's just this sort of collective ennui and mediocrity. And I think everyone at the football club, but particularly the new executives that have come in, like Ashworth and Wilcox and Barada, they're all just trying to pinpoint why. And of course, if they end up pinpointing that it's Ten Hag and his culture and his management, then eventually at some point, if results don't improve, he'll go. But it may be that they're still sort of working out exactly what's causing this. And that's the big difference for me between the Glazers versus, for example, this new sporting-led regime. They're so visible every day. They're so accountable and present that, unlike the Glazers, any day, they can be speaking to anyone. So whereas some have reported there's like a 100-day review that took place, led by Sir Dave Brailsford, and that's kind of true to my understanding at the point when they first came in. There's really still this continuous review ongoing at Manchester United that may prove never ending, at least as far as this season or this year is concerned. And every single day, somebody, whether it's a Brailsford, Ratcliffe himself, Jean-Claude Blanc, Barada, Wilcox, Ashworth, somebody is speaking to people at every levels of the club, face to face, in a very hands-on business and sports strategic style, to find out the root cause of the project. So everyone is accountable. And what it means is, unlike during the eras under the Glazers, from Sir Alex Ferguson, when things sort of turn more negative, to now, there is the ability for everyone to input, but also for the leadership to find out firsthand and straight from the horse's mouth what the root cause is. So players are going to get the opportunity to speak in favour or even potentially against Ten Hag, as is everybody else in the football department as well. New voices and old voices, and they're all going to be able to input, because there is that visibility, that transparency and that accountability, which is why I think that the new part of Manchester United's ownership don't want to make decisions quickly. But when they do, it will be because they've spoken to people at every level of the football club to understand the problem firsthand, rather than the Glazers, who were perhaps cutthroat at times, but much more distant in coming to whatever the strategy or the decision was, at least on the football side.
Yeah, I think it is worth probably mentioning at this stage in regards to Ineos that, look, if Ineos never came in, let's say there was no takeover whatsoever and it was just completely the Glazers throughout the summer and even up until now, I think the Glazers, as you mentioned and alluded to a little bit, that they would have got a lot of criticism for the way that things have been handled. And I do believe that with Ineos, we need to be honest, we need to hold them accountable for situations and their beginnings at Manchester United, which haven't exactly been great in terms of the treatment of Erik Ten Hag. So they're certainly going to hope that things will turn around very quickly in regards to their new dawn and their new era at Manchester United. But I do believe one area that they did get right was the appointment of Ruud van Nistelrooy in the coaching staff. I think it was a very savvy move to bring someone in with some managerial experience and, of course, Manchester United experience. He was obviously at the club and he was arguably their best player when he was there. So that was a very wise decision. But I don't think people could have foreseen how wise that could be when you actually look at the situation now, because you've got almost the interim manager waiting if anything does happen to Erik Ten Hag's job. So if that was to happen, where would you see this situation going on? Because of course he was a manager before he came to Manchester United. He's took a demotion, if we can call it that, to become the second in charge or in command in the coaching staff at Old Trafford. So if he was to be appointed as an interim, which is my understanding is probably the most likely outcome, if of course Manchester United do decide to take a different direction, would that be an interim role until the summer? Would it be only for a few games? Would it be to buy Ineos a bit more time? How do you see this one playing out if, of course, it is Van Nistelrooy to take over from Ten Hag in the short-term future?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's an if, first of all, because the preference is for Ten Hag to succeed, and the ownership, particularly the Ratcliffe-type people representing Ineos or have been appointed by them, like Omar Barada, they have held conversations with Ruud van Nistelrooy at the time of his appointment, of course, as you would expect, but also after as well. And some of those conversations have been with Ten Hag and wider members of the coaching staff, and others have been one-on-one with Ruud van Nistelrooy. And in every conversation, from appointment to integration to now, Ruud van Nistelrooy has impressed. And the reasons for that are because they think he has a bond with the playing staff. They think he has the respect of the fan base. They know he understands the culture of the football club, but they also think that he understands, and I think this is a very underrated point, all the bad stuff from when he was there. And when you're at a club and it succeeds, or when you're a player that's elite, just because you're doing well, it doesn't mean that you don't spot the decline or you wouldn't have changed things. If you find any club or any individual at a club that's succeeding and winning things, and at the end of winning things, they don't go, but there was something wrong, there's an alarm bell. So actually, and I'm sure Sir Alex Ferguson would probably say the same, when you're at your peak and when Fergie was on the way out, it's almost certainly true from speaking to sources that Fergie realised that he was almost overperforming with what he had in those latter years. And at the time he went, I'm sure he even realised that the era after him would be hard, because at that point you see other clubs with better training facilities, better stadiums, bigger football departments, more global, more multi-club, and you have to adapt. And therefore, Ruud van Nistelrooy has seen a lot of both Manchester United and English football. He's got his management badges, and he's now working very effectively with Ten Hag. So we shouldn't overread into next step, because the key point here is that Ruud van Nistelrooy is a hire for Ten Hag, one driven by the current head coach, rather than somebody that may be a threat to Ten Hag or may make this ownership make up their mind to get rid of Ten Hag because there's someone readily available. And I think in that light, we shouldn't presume that Van Nistelrooy is there waiting in the wings for an option, or the ownership know that it will be a smooth transition if they get rid of Ten Hag just because Van Nistelrooy is there. Because actually he's doing everything the Ten Hag way, with the Ten Hag culture, backing the Ten Hag decisions, being very loyal to ultimately the manager that drove his appointment. But the one-on-one conversations between Ruud van Nistelrooy and the ownership show there is that respect and trust. And of course, were Ten Hag to go, then you have somebody that is able to provide at least a stopgap. And I'm still told it wouldn't necessarily be more than anything like that, because a permanent Manchester United manager is less likely to go down that route of a bit less experience, but a massive amount of Manchester United experience. And that was the case with, say, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer as well. I think they want elite. I think they want someone with a proven track record. I think they want someone with a bit more long-term experience than Ruud van Nistelrooy. But the beauty of interim, much like Lee Carsley in England, is that you can start with interim and short term if they go down that route. And again, we don't want to be disrespectful to Ten Hag and presume yet that that's the case, because Manchester United are calm about the situation. But if they put in Ruud van Nistelrooy, then rather than forcing themselves to get an appointment today, tomorrow, next week, next month, they could see how it goes and almost give him a rolling interim opportunity, whether for half a season or whether for a full season. And then you have your cake and eat it, because you wait for the right candidate, you interview under the presumption that that interim won't necessarily be front runner to get the full-time gig. But if they change your mind in the interim position, then you never know. They can be a candidate. And I think that would be Manchester United's thinking. Number one, they still want to make it work with Ten Hag. Number two, that Ruud van Nistelrooy was not hired because he could step into the hot seat. He was very much hired as an assistant, wanting to make it work with Ten Hag. Number three, if they need an interim, yes, of course he's there, but they're hardly at the point of lining him up or promoting him to that role. And then number four, that Lee Carsley model of Van Nistelrooy would likely want to put himself in the hat. And the longer he stays interim, the more he would have the opportunity whilst they look at other candidates to try and effectively change the ownership's mind. And Lee Carsley might be the same at England. I don't think Carsley, when Southgate left, was the FA's front and centre choice. But if he does well, then you think things are working, the players like him, results have turned, why not? And I think Van Nistelrooy would hypothetically be in that kind of grey area between short term and maybe being a candidate. But the brief from the summer, when they were reviewing Ten Hag and speaking to others, and backed up by who they spoke to, was about very proven, experienced managers that had operated at the highest level. They spoke to Thomas Tuchel. They approached Maurizio Pochettino. And in the past, they have mentioned and looked at people even like Graham Potter, who'd obviously been at Chelsea, been at Brighton. And all of them on paper are more experienced than Ruud van Nistelrooy. So he would kind of be the anomaly because he's in at the club and has that Manchester United link and has that favour from the fan base. But at the moment, I'm told that first, he's not actually being lined up yet. So we're getting ahead of ourselves. And second, the brief in the summer, and you would presume it would be the same one if Ten Hag goes because not long has passed, was very much to find a more experienced candidate, which means that Van Nistelrooy, regardless of what happens, may struggle to get that job in the long term.
Yeah, I think with the Ruud van Nistelrooy link, it is quite a fascinating one. But I think with the Van Nistelrooy situation, I think Manchester United have to be very careful with how they handle this, because of course it would make sense, considering he's already at the club, to put him in as an interim boss, if you like, if of course they do decide to get rid of Erik Ten Hag. But I think they need to make it very clear if of course he's an interim to just basically, as you alluded to fill the gap while they look for other individuals or candidates, or if he does have an opportunity to almost prove himself, a little bit like Ole Gunnar Solskjaer did. Now, of course, the emotion with Manchester United fans has always been something quite difficult to deal with. That's often been the thing that's got in the way a lot of the times, whether it's transfers, whether it's managers, players, whatever you like. The emotion has been a difficult thing to sort of navigate through. But if you take that back and you take that away from this situation, you're completely right. The experience of Ruud van Nistelrooy, I'm sure he'll go on to have an amazing managerial career. But is he currently at the level required to turn things around at Manchester United and really bring that drastic change that's required? I'm not so sure, but we'll see, of course, how it unfolds. And just before we do talk about a couple of names that have been potentially linked with the role at Manchester United, you said one or two there that I'm sure Manchester United fans won't be happy with. But we will just talk about Ten Hag. One final question. Of course, this is all hypothetical. Of course, we're not discussing this in terms of clickbait or trying to, push him out the door, essentially, which, of course, I don't think my opinion will have any impact on that. But if Manchester United do go down the route of parting ways with Erik Ten Hag, how much would that cost them? Of course, you said that they triggered a 1 year extension within his contract. Would that mean that it's another year's wages added on, or would because it was a part of the contract initially, would that sort of sacking fee, if you like, be the same? Where are we at in terms of any costs that would be sort of put forward for Ten Hag if he was to be let go?
Yeah, they'd have to agree a settlement with him. I don't think it would actually be a lump sum payment. If you look at most Premier League managers these days, they tend to be kept on the books until they find a new gig or their contract expires. And because it was only a 1 year extension, it is cheaper than, as I said before, handing him a bumper new deal and then finding that you're ending that with 2, 3, 4, 5 years or whatever it is remaining. And any bumper deal might have had a pay increase and fresh compensation terms. So if they get to that point, then it's likely to cost Manchester United somewhere in the region of 5 to 7 million, is what I'm told. But again, it will just depend upon the settlement that they reach and what kind of terms there are. And they're not always contractual. That's what people don't sort of get, that you can just say, okay, you've got 3 years left on the contract. This happened with Julian Nagelsmann, for example, when he left Bayern. We'll keep paying you until you get work. And with De Zerbi, he left. And then after he'd left, Brighton was still due compensation because he got a job within a set time frame. So with Ten Hag, you may find that Manchester United, due to PSR, choose to negotiate a compensation settlement that might actually allow them to pay him more money beyond the 1 year that they trigger if he stays out of work, almost like gardening leave type money. And then you can either spread that across a longer period of time in order to offset PSR, or you can hope that you won't pay the full amount. So you offer a large amount of money over a long period of time, but you say, and this is very common, it's subject to the manager being out of work. So then if he gets a job within 6 months, 10 months, and you'd agreed to pay him over, let's just call it 24 months, then you stop paying when that new job happens. So you end up paying less because he's not been out of work for that long. So it's quite hard to estimate, but sources say that it's unlikely to be this kind of one lump sum immediately when he leaves payment that will necessarily cause too many imminent PSR concerns. It would be more a spread settlement payment to be agreed between the two parties.
Yeah, that old PSR, them three letters are always haunting everyone, aren't they, in football at the moment?
Yeah, but also on the PSR thing, we get a lot of sort of scaremongering. And obviously, I fully respect everybody's reporting. So I'm not pointing to a specific thing or report about it. I'm making a more general point that if, and it is an if because it's being challenged and debated and discussed, but if PSR is to be replaced, then should that get ratified, for example, at the next Premier League AGM, it will present more flexibility to Manchester United and other clubs, even with anchoring, comparative to if PSR continues for another season. And then again, if Manchester United do or don't make Champions League football and so on. So there's a lot of variables about what will put Manchester United in a position where they're very PSR conscious versus what won't. And because we've got such a long period between now and the end of the season, when we know whether PSR is continuing, whether we know Manchester United have got Champions League football, and whether we know if they're capable of either getting a big outgoing fee coming in Or, who knows? I mean, I think it's probably a bit premature, but what if Greenwood has an incredible season at Marseille and then someone says, okay, I'm coming immediately and in 12 months' time with a crazy amount of money, then Manchester United have got a huge sell-on percentage as well. So when we're crunching the numbers, we can only sort of project. And it's true that in a doomsday scenario of no Champions League football, PSR continues for the foreseeable or indefinite future because there's a roadblock towards squad cost control measures coupled with anchoring and no ability to bring in a massive fee for some of your more high value players or get players off the books like Casemiro, for example, in the short to medium term. Yeah, if all of these things don't happen, then they, like many big clubs, are going to be worried about PSR. But the opposite could happen. PSR could be changed. They could get Champions League football. They could bring in a lot of money through outgoings, and then they could find themselves actually in a very healthy position. So we should be a little bit cautious about the sort of negativity at this point around PSR, because you've got a January window, you've got the first half of next year, and you've got a whole season ahead of you.
Yeah, of course, of course. Ben, we are running out of time, but we do need to get through a couple big names. When I've got an individual like you spending a bit of time with me talking about United, I need to get as much information as possible. I need you to basically calm me down here. I need you to calm the whole of a large part of the Manchester United fan base. There's a certain name going around with Gareth Southgate. Now, of course, he's not in a job at the moment. He has got a couple of friends very high up at Manchester United now, but there are obviously quite a lot of outlets denying that there is concrete interest and genuine belief that he will come into Manchester United. I think he even did an interview not so long ago, within the last week or two, suggesting even that his next role may not even be in a managerial dugout. So where are we at with Gareth Southgate in terms of Manchester United? Please tell me this one isn't happening.
Well, I mean, I'm going to cover all the names in one go. And again, people always will sort of take the name out of context. But as I've reported pretty consistently, they've not approached anybody. So in terms of the names, we can only go upon the summer period when they're reviewing Ten Hag and their succession planning. And in that succession planning, it is true that Southgate was mentioned. It's true that Potter was contacted. He didn't deny it when he was asked outright. And in addition to that, we know there were talks with Thomas Tuchel. We know Maurizio Pochettino, who's now with the US, was discussed as well. So if you open up a vacancy, then the brief, the names, apart from the ones that are no longer available, and the process will not be too dissimilar to the groundwork that they laid over the summer and the succession planning that they did, but they stuck with Ten Hag. So now going forwards, when someone says this person's the front runner or Manchester United want this manager, none of that is true to my understanding, because they want to make it work with Ten Hag and they've not done anything since the summer. So all we can say is likely names based on the summer, not active names, not ones that they are speaking to now, and definitely not one individual name that is a front runner or a definite target that they would go to, because it would be an interview process with multiple candidates. So based on the succession planning, it is true that Southgate was one of those. And if Southgate wanted a Manchester United interview, it's likely he would get a Manchester United interview. It doesn't mean he's going to get the job. It doesn't mean he's a front runner. It doesn't mean he's the most likely for the role or should suddenly jump as the bookies' favourite. And it doesn't mean that we need meltdown from the Manchester United fan base. But it is also the case that he will be somebody that internally at Manchester United, they will want to approach in the same way that they have discussed and would discuss Eddie Howe, the same potentially for Graham Potter as well. Thomas Tuchel's a bit more of a wild card because they've had that conversation, and I'm not convinced that either side really wanted to progress. We get kind of mixed narratives here. Some say it was the Tuchel side that had the conversation and walked away, but I'd be surprised by that because Tuchel was welcoming a Manchester United approach and wanting that sort of ability to speak to them for weeks and weeks and weeks. So to have one conversation and walk away would surprise me, but that is what sources close to the Tuchel side say, that it was them that decided they didn't want to progress long before they made a decision about Erik Ten Hag's future, whereas the Manchester United side say that they approached Tuchel and decided after that conversation that he wasn't to be the candidate and they wanted to stick with Erik Ten Hag. So again, I come back to what I said before. It's premature to be saying this manager, that manager, favorite, not favorite, this is the one they want. They're not there yet. All they've done is mention, discussed, and in some cases approached these names in the summer before deciding Ten Hag was right. And you can come up with whatever theory you want for that. But obviously, Manchester United sources are clear it was because they wanted Ten Hag. Others will speculate that nobody impressed them or they couldn't get the right name or whatever. But that's not what Manchester United sources say. They make it clear Ten Hag was the overwhelming choice after that review. So if there's a vacancy, they'll come back to those same candidates again. But we can't tell you at this point as journalists responsibly that there's one leading candidate or favourite, because right now at the time of recording, they have not approached again since the summer a single name, and they've not held a single interview.
Yeah, well, as long as that includes Gareth Southgate, I think we should be okay. But look, no disrespect to Gareth Southgate. I don't think necessarily it's to do with him individually or personally. I just think there's just such a clear ceiling, which I think Manchester United fans are very scared of, and I think it would be rather underwhelming. But who knows? We could be sat here in a couple of months, a couple of weeks, or heaven forbid, a couple of days talking about this again, Ben. But thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. The ever reliable Ben Jacobs there joining us on the MUFC MPB channel. Thank you, Ben.
Always a pleasure. Speak soon.
Thank you very much. And of course, thank you to everyone who has watched today's episode. Please be sure to like, subscribe, follow on the YouTube as well as the X accounts. Ben's absolutely across everything, not just Man United. So be sure to drop him a follow. I've been your host today, Anil Kandola. Thank you so much once again. And who knows, next time I sit here, we may even be talking about a new Manchester United manager. Until then, thank you very much, and I'll see you very soon.
Subscribe to the MUFC MPB YouTube channel.